Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. In a time when the judiciary is under intense scrutiny, when the line between law and politics seems increasingly blurred, and when the very foundations of our democracy are being tested, we will turn today to someone who has dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice with insight, wisdom, and compassion. It is my honor to be joined today by Judge David Tatel, a man whose story is as inspiring as it is instructive. For nearly 3 decades, Judge Tatel served on the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, often called the second most powerful court in the country. But his journey to and on the bench is a testament to perseverance, adaptability, and an unswerving commitment to equal justice under the law. In his new memoir, Vision, a memoir of blindness and justice, Judge Tatel takes us behind the curtain of his remarkable life, from his early days as a civil rights lawyer fighting for school integration to his years on the bench deciding landmark cases on environmental protection, voting rights, education, and issues of the law inside the White House, all while navigating the challenges of progressive vision loss and ultimately blindness. Judge Tatel's story is not just about overcoming personal obstacles. It's a lens through which we can examine the evolution of civil rights, the role of the judiciary, our democracy, and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice in America. As we grapple with deep divisions in our society and face critical questions about the future of the law and our institutions, Judge Tatel's insights couldn't be more timely or relevant. Judge David Tatel served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit for nearly 30 years. Prior to that, he had a remarkable career as a civil rights lawyer, including private and government positions, and focused heavily on equal educational opportunities and access to justice. He was a director of the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of HEW during the Carter administration and in private practice for many years. It is my pleasure to welcome Judge David Tatel here to talk about Vision, a memoir of blindness and justice. Judge Tatel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it is a delight to have you here. Talk first about growing up. Where did you grow up? And your father was a scientist, and you were fascinated by science. And somewhere along the way, and we'll talk about that, you made a turn to the law. But talk a little bit about your early childhood.
Yes, I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the late 40s and 50s. My dad came to Washington. He was a physicist, and like many scientists, he came to Washington as part of the war effort during World War II, and I grew up I grew up among scientists. My dad took me to his lab on Saturdays. I like to say that growing up in the Tatel household was like growing up in a science fair project because there were experiments everywhere. I even, when I was 15 years old, went on a month and a half scientific expedition with him to the Peruvian Altiplano. So my life was science. That's where I grew up, and those are the adults who I knew were scientists. And when I went off to the University of Michigan in 1959, I planned to be a scientist, but I like to say I was hijacked by the 1960s because, yes, I started in physics and engineering and math, but it was the civil rights movement, the turmoil and fascination of the civil rights movement, the freedom rides and the lunch counter sit-ins, and the papers were full of civil rights issues, and it was an exciting time. And long story short, I decided that I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, and so I shifted to political science and went on to law school. That's how that happened.
Talk a little bit about the nexus, as you look back at it, between science and the curiosity that goes with that, the way problems get solved within the context of science, and how you translated that as you look back on the experience to the law and to things that you cared passionately about and things that you wanted to change in society.
Well, the connection between science and law, Jeff, goes all the way back to that trip to Peru that I mentioned. At night, around dinner time, the scientists, I was a 15-year-old kid watching the scientists talk about their hypothesis and the data they had collected during the day. And they were listening to each other and debating what they had learned and reaching conclusions. And years later, when I became a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals, and I was in conference resolving cases with my colleagues, it struck me that I was doing the same thing there that my father and his colleagues were doing all those years earlier in Peru. They were working with the laws of science. I was working with the Constitution. We were all deeply interested in making sure we had the right facts. They got their facts through experimentation and investigation. I got my facts from the district court or the agency, but in an interesting way, we were engaged in exactly the same process. That is, trying as objectively as we could to apply objective standards to accurate facts.
And in many cases, also the process of trying to solve a problem, whether it was a racial problem or a scientific problem, using all of those available resources to solve something.
Yes, especially what I saw when I was a kid, especially the collegiality of the scientists. It was very clear. It obviously became clearer to me in retrospective. I was only a kid then, but as I look back on that, I saw a half a dozen close colleagues who respected each other, debating and discussing an important scientific question and trying to reach a resolution of it, to try to resolve what they were seeking, and that's what made science. Science is collaborative, but so is judging. My court, on an appeals court, we have panels of 3 judges. On the Supreme Court, it's 9, and it's a critical part of the judging process is the discussion among the judges. The judges using the same rules of judging and looking at the same facts, debating, discussing, listening to each other, sometimes even changing their minds. And that kind of collegiality is just as critical to the judging process as it is to the scientific process.
As you look at all of this through the lens of today, to what extent has that changed? Have we lost so much ability to listen to each other today, for people to change their minds? And it's even infected science today, as we've unfortunately seen in the past several years.
Yes, well, I can speak more towards the non-scientific community. Obviously, nationwide, yes, there's less debate, less respectful consideration of opposing views. And my concern is that has crept into the courts also. Just in the 30 years I spent on my court, and not only my court, but watching the Supreme Court, it's obvious that the judicial collegiality that is so critical to the judging process has frayed seriously.
Is it your sense that fraying is repairable?
Yes, of course it is. Of course it's repairable. It will take time. It will take, at least on the courts, it will take judges recommitting themselves to the collegiality that's critical to judging. Yes, how it will get repaired, it will take time, Jeff, and it may take new judges. It'll take leadership in the judiciary, but it can be repaired. A lot of it still exists. It's not gone. There's a huge amount of, there's a great deal of judicial collegiality that still exists in our federal system, and we just need to rebuild it.
Talk a little bit, coming back to your own personal experience, and when you first realized that there was something wrong vis-a-vis your eyesight. It took a while to diagnose.
Yes, I tell the story in the book. When I was a little kid, I had trouble seeing at night. And my parents nobody knew whether there was anything wrong, much less what it was. Some people said, well, nobody can see at night. What's your problem? But it was very clear that I was having much more trouble than my friends at night. I would get lost in a dark theater. My mom and dad took me to ophthalmologists, but they didn't know what it was. The main advice we got was have David eat carrots, and I ate lots of carrots when I was growing up. But when I was 15, my mother took me to the National Institutes of Health out here in Bethesda, and I was diagnosed there with a genetic eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa. And that's when we first put a name on the problem that I was dealing with.
And when you were first diagnosed and you learned that this was something that was progressive, talk a little bit about your reaction to it, what you imagined.
You know, it's a little easier for me to answer that question now, having written this book, than it would have been 5 years ago, because in writing the book, I really did have to think deeply about some of these past experiences in a way that I hadn't before. And what I recall from the experience, it was obviously a formative experience for a 15-year-old kid, is I was told by the doctors that I had a genetic disease, a genetic eye disease. They didn't know much about it then. I mean, this was just 4 or 5 years after scientists discovered the double helix. That's how long ago this was. They knew that that my eyesight would probably deteriorate slowly, that it might plateau from time to time. And would I ever go blind? I remember, the best I can remember, Jeff, is that I was told maybe, but maybe not. And was that what I was really told? I don't know. I mean, what 15-year-old kid wants to be told he's going to go blind? Maybe they did say that to me, but my recollection of it 60 years later is I was told they just didn't know. And in fact, they were right, because over the next 15 to 20 years, my sight continued to deteriorate. Nighttime, dark nighttime areas were increasingly difficult. And the scariest thing was that it was very obvious that my peripheral vision was narrowing, and so they were right. It continued to deteriorate, and in my mid-30s, within a year or two, it just took a dramatic decline, and I basically lost most of my sight at that point.
And you spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of energy being, if not in denial, resisting the reality of it, or certainly resisting the willingness to embrace it in any kind of way. Talk about that.
Again, something that I've come to understand much better from writing this memoir. Well, first thing is, when you're a 15-year-old kid, you know, who wants to be different from his friends? I didn't want to say to my friends, "Oh, I can't get the popcorn because in the theater because I can't see, because I have a genetic eye disease." Instead, I made up ways in which I could go get the popcorn. I would count the seats to the aisle and count the aisles up to the popcorn stand, and then count backwards back to my seat. So I was able to get the popcorn without revealing to anybody that I had this problem. And I had lots of tricks like that. And I needed more and more tricks as my sight declined. And then as I got older in law school, and then more so when I started working, I assumed that I worried, and I think quite legitimately, that someone with a serious visual disability and potential blindness would have trouble getting a job. And by then, I was totally focused on becoming a civil rights lawyer. That's what I wanted to do. And I'm sure that went into my mind also. So yeah, I covered it up as much as I could. And for the few people who began to understand it, I didn't talk about it, and people pretty much respected that. Even later, when I reluctantly, probably years too late, got a mobility cane and was obviously a blind person, I still didn't talk about it. I didn't. And by that point, the motivation was different. The motivation was I wanted to be considered on the merits. I wanted people to view me as a effective civil rights lawyer, and then later on, effective judge who happened to be blind, not a blind judge. So, and to me, that made a big difference, at least.
In addition to the difference that it made on the outside and the way people would perceive you, what's the difference that it made in terms of your own sense of work, that you had to work so much harder sometimes in order to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish? One, because of the disability that you were dealing with, but also because you were putting the effort into covering it up. Talk about that, how that impacted the work.
That's a really good question because, I mean, there are two levels at which I could answer that. One is just the constant, anxiety of managing this cover up for all those years. Obviously, it created a lot more tension and uncertainty in my own mind than if I had just been honest about it. No question about that. And at another level, as I began to shift to requiring more and more technology, like the use of readers and recording devices and people to travel with and things like that, the logistics of life became extremely complicated. When you're blind, you can't just get up in the morning and lead, and the day goes from morning to afternoon to evening. Constant planning and making arrangements, and do I have someone? Can I get from here to there? What do I need to read later in the day? The logistics of living are extremely complicated and sometimes totally exhausting, to be honest.
How do you think that your work or your career might have been different? If it's always tough or to understand a counterfactual, but how might it have been different if you weren't dealing with this, or even if you weren't putting all that effort and energy into covering it up?
I don't think anything young David Tatel did was unreasonable or irrational. I think it was only human what he did, and I don't think he was unjustified in worrying about his future. I think the situation is different today. In fact, I would advise young people today who are going through what I did to be much more honest about it. I think it would be better for them. One of the reasons why, Jeff, I think I covered it up so much is when people read my book, they'll see how important role models were to me in my career. They were really important. Certain judges and lawyers were my role model. I wanted to be like them, but there were no blind role models. And so I don't think, as I said before, I wasn't unjustified in worrying about could I be one of them, because there were no blind of them of any kind. One of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to fill that gap for young people going through what I went through. I hope they'll read this book and see they can be more honest about their disability, because as I hope the book demonstrates to people, even somebody who's blind can function at the highest level of our judicial system. So maybe this will be the role model that I lacked.
The other part of that equation is the way in which it's shaped, and this goes to the heart of your civil rights work and I'm sure many, many decisions along the way, how this experience shaped your worldview, how it impacted your compassion, your understanding, your sense of personal responsibility, and how that shaped the way you looked at cases.
I've thought about that so much as I wrote this book. I really did try, because people asked me the same question you did as I was writing, and I have to say I don't know the answer to that. As I look back, what motivated me as a college student, and then as a law student, and as a young lawyer, what motivated me to be a civil rights lawyer was what was the values of the civil rights movement itself. I so respected the judges and the lawyers and the marchers who were involved in that. It was those values and the values of equal opportunity that that motivated my career more than anything. Now, did my loss of sight also influence that? Did that make me more empathetic? Jeff, I just don't know the answer to that. As much as I've thought about it in writing the book, I just don't think I know what the answer is.
It's interesting because we've certainly seen cases in the world where, not necessarily in the legal profession, but where the reverse is true. People that are struggling with a disability, it makes them angry. It makes them look at other people differently because they're not suffering with something and need to take more responsibility. I mean, it has the ability to cut both ways.
Yes, well, that isn't me, but I don't want your listeners to misunderstand here. I mean, being blind is hard. And I say right in the prologue of the book, I'd really rather not be blind. But but it certainly hasn't made me. It's so frustrating sometimes to be blind. I mean, yeah, you get really annoyed when your technology fails, or when you bump into a wall, or when you lose your place somewhere. It's frustrating. It's upsetting. It's annoying. It's difficult. But uh, but it I don't feel I don't feel sorry for myself. It hasn't made me negative, but I also really can't answer your question about whether how it's influenced me in other ways. I grew up in a wonderful household. My two wonderful parents, who were deeply empathetic people who were, you know, they were as fascinated and as interested in public issues then as I became later. So obviously, much of what I am comes from my parents and from the 1960s. And I just think that those are the dominant factors for me. Now, did blindness affect all that? I just don't know. I don't know whether would I have been a civil rights lawyer if I wasn't blind? I think absolutely. I don't think that contributed to that.
And talk about the extension of what you're saying, the decision to write the book and to embrace this in a different way now, and the addition of Vixen, which you can talk about, into your life.
Yeah. So yes, I had no plans to. I had pretty much made a decision that I would retire from the court. I loved the work, but I didn't think it was good to stay forever, even though it's a lifetime appointment. But when I made the decision, as I was thinking about what I would do in retirement, I really hadn't planned to write a book. I didn't even want to write one, but some dear friends pushed back on that, and they encouraged me to try to tell my story because they thought it could be inspirational to people, and that kind of connected with me. I thought, gee, that's an interesting idea. Maybe I should do it if in fact I could write something that would help other people and be inspirational. And what's surprising to me about the experience, Jeff, and I had no, when I went into this, I thought, okay, I can write a memoir. You start at the beginning and you tell your story and you get to the end and you're done, right? Well, that's wrong in two big respects. One is, and I've already alluded to this, writing a memoir is far more complex than that. You can't just tell your story. You have to think about what is the meaning of the story, which I've really tried to do in the memoir. I've tried to explain the best I can what this story means. And there's a lot in the book that was new to me. It's there because while writing, I had to think about a lot of hard issues, and not just by myself, but with my wife, Edie. This book is as much a book about the two of us as it is about me. It's about my blindness and about her living with a husband who's blind and how it affected our marriage and our kids. So as I was writing the book, we talked a huge amount about those. So many of the things that are in here were sort of revelations from those discussions. What did the doctors tell me at the beginning? What did I tell Edie when we first met? What did we think about when we first had children? all of those that are in this book came about because of the deep, deep thinking that I had to do in writing the book. So the book was just this enormous adventure, you know. And I think to go on to your next question about the book, I would not have had an interview like this 5 years ago because I hadn't written the book. Writing the book, in a sense, freed me to talk more candidly about blindness, as did my guide dog, because when you have a cane, uh, yeah, you're obviously blind, but people don't come up to you and say, "Oh, tell me how the cane works," or "Gee, can I have one of those?" But when you have a guide dog, everybody wants to talk to you about the dog and how you work. You can't avoid being a blind person when you have a guide dog. And having Vixen just made me so much more comfortable in talking to people about being blind and using the guide dog. So the combination of the book, writing the book, and having Vixen is what produced this far more candid explanation of me than I had ever done before. And the other factor, and maybe the most powerful factor of all, is Edie's role in this whole thing. I mean, she's the one who's lived through this with me. She's the one who, accepted for all those years my desire to downplay it. And, it's her support and her involvement in writing this book that also helped free me to talk so much more candidly about blindness. So I never thought that writing a memoir could have such an impact on the author as this book has had for me. And I'll just say one more thing. The other thing I had no idea about is the reaction to the book has been totally fascinating to me. I get an email, one or two, or sometimes three emails a day from people I don't know who have read the book, who say, "You've told my story." These are people who did what I did, who, when they were growing up, they also hid their blindness. They also covered it up, which has, made me even more comfortable with the decision to write the book. And I hope that, and as I think about that experience, Jeff, when I was a kid or a young man and covering it up, I didn't have anybody to talk to about this. It was very lonely. But here I'm finding out with all these emails I'm getting that there were lots of people going through exactly the same thing at the same time. So again, maybe this book will help someone who's going through it now to realize, hey, they're not alone. There's a lot of other people who have the same experience, and you can survive it.
And certainly the other overlay to this, which we have to at least touch on, is the degree to which the legal world, that the underpinnings have changed during this long lifetime that you write about, that so much of your early work, so many earlier cases, really are different in the context of the legal world and the political world today. That as you went through this story, that there had to be, I suppose, some realization that the world had changed in so many ways. We've come a long way since the 60s.
Oh my gosh, it's unbelievable. I mean, if you think about it, that first of all, when I was struggling as a young, there were no laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability. Now we have the Rehabilitation Act, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have lots of state and local laws that have been passed, and the legal rights of people with disabilities are much better established than they were then. And so that's one big factor. The other factor, and I talk a lot about this in the book because it's sort of fun, is the impact of technology. I mean, technology has completely changed my life. I can only speak for myself, but I think it's true of other blind people. When I started on the DC circuit over 30 years ago, I had a full-time reader. Actually, I had a full-time reader and a backup reader, and they read everything to me. And my last year on the court, my reader hardly read anything to me, and now I don't have one because I can do everything myself now with technology. And the reason that's so wonderful is that not only does it make life easier, but the most important thing, at least to me, in struggling with blindness is to find ways to be independent, not to be dependent on other people, to be able to do things by myself. And now, 20 years ago, I couldn't get up in the morning and read the papers by myself. Now I read the newspapers by myself. I read books by myself. I don't need anybody to help me with those things. I can function, Jeff, in terms of the reading world, just like you.
And in terms of the law, in terms of what you've seen happen to the courts and the justice system and the way they've become politicized, talk a little bit about that before we wrap up.
Well, my concern, and the last third of my book is about this, and my book focuses on the Supreme Court. Well, first of all, I tell my own story about civil rights cases I've worked on, and many of the cases I worked on at the DC Circuit that I thought would interest my readers. But the last two chapters of the book are about the areas of the law I know best: environmental cases and voting rights. And my concern in this area is that because as the courts have become more politicized in the past decade or so, and consisting of judges more interested in a policy agenda than in applying the law objectively, our courts, particularly the Supreme Court, has slowly but clearly increased its power at the expense of the two elected branches of government. It's done this by disregarding principles of judicial restraint that are critical to preserving the separation of powers. I'm deeply worried about that. And I've tried to make the case in these two chapters about environmental cases and voting rights cases.
And in the voting rights cases, talk about what worries you about that.
There's two things that worry me about the voting rights cases. I'd say the last chapter of the book, that is the one before the chapter about Vixen, which is called The Dog That Changed My Life. The chapter before that is called The Future of Democracy. And there's two themes in there. One is the obvious one, which is that the Supreme Court, by invalidating the key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and weakening the other provisions of the Act, has made it a lot easier for states, particularly southern states, to erect obstacles to voting. And if you think about democracy, what's more threatening to a democracy than limiting people's ability to vote? And since the Supreme Court did this, we've seen this day in and day out. You have to pick up today's papers, and you'll see examples of some states, of certain states, making it more difficult for people to vote. So it's hard to think of a greater threat to democracy. But the other threat to democracy, which is I articulate in that chapter and in the previous chapter about the environment, is the behavior of the Supreme Court itself. As the Supreme Court increases, its justices and judges are appointed for life. We don't have to run for election. The only thing that limits judicial power is the self-restraint of the judges themselves. And I believe that it is a threat to democracy to have the unelected branch of government, that is the courts, assume more and more power at the expense of the elected branches, because it takes those issues away from the electorates. You can't vote against the Supreme Court decision, so those are the two threats to democracy that I articulate in those chapters.
And if you were on the D.C. Circuit today, how much more frustrated would you be by what has happened, particularly on the Supreme Court?
Well, that's a really good question, and that is one of the several reasons why I decided to retire. I decided to retire because first I mentioned to you earlier, although I love the work, I didn't think judges should stay forever. I think it's healthy for the institution for judges to retire at a particular point. I also candidly admitted that I wanted to retire when my successor could be appointed by a president who would look for the best possible judge to serve in my seat, and not necessarily one who would pursue a particular objective. And I also say in there that Although, I was perfectly comfortable for years, decades, having the Supreme Court review my work and disagree with me even. It wasn't a problem for me then because the court and I were applying the same rules. We were operating in the same system. If they interpreted a statute differently than I did, fine, that's their job. If they interpreted a precedent differently than I did, then fine, that's their job. But now we have a court that I think is not very faithful to the Constitution and to the statutes Congress passed, indeed to its own precedents. And they're producing decisions that I, as a Court of Appeals judge, would be bound to apply. And I became increasingly frustrated with doing that, particularly since I believe that those Supreme Court decisions are doing severe damage to our democracy and to our environment. And so I decided that since I was bound by those decisions and was more increasingly uncomfortable with applying them, that the best thing for me would be to retire. And that's why I did it. And I don't look back for a second. There's some things I do miss, but I'm very, very comfortable with the decision I made, particularly given what happened at the end of the most recent Supreme Court term.
Judge David Tatel, his book is Vision, a memoir of blindness and justice. Judge Tatel, I thank you so very much for spending time with us today.
Jeff, thank you. I've enjoyed your questions and our conversation.
Thank you.